16 months without rain, and one woman's herd was still eating. Every ranch around her had sold off or shut down. The man who had laughed the loudest was coming back God, but not to laugh.
He had come to say something that would cost him everything he thought he knew.
The summer Willa Grantham's neighbors stopped laughing was the same summer they stopped eating well. That was the truth nobody said aloud in Beulah Springs, not at the feed store, not at the post office, not over the fence lines that divided one failing stretch of range from the next. The truth lived in the silences between men who had known this land for 30 years and were watching it turn against them in ways their fathers had never described. It lived in the hollow sound a water bucket made when it came up from a nearly dry well. It lived in the way a grown man could stand at the edge of his own pasture at first light and not be able to look directly at what his herd had become. Cutter Flats had been without real rain since May of 1883. Not entirely without moisture, there had been a thin scatter of drops in October that barely wet the topsoil before evaporating, and a gray week in February that left the ground damp for 3 days before the wind pulled it dry again. But the kind of rain that soaked deep, that reached roots, that filled the rock-lined catch basins along the lower ridge that rain had not come in more than 10 months. The creek that ran along the base of the Saddleback Formation, the one older residents called simply the creek as though there were no other, had pulled back from its banks by late autumn and gone to stones and cracked mud by January. Where children had once waded in summer shallows, they now walked a pale bed of caliche and sun-bleached stone, finding no water and no reason to linger. Silas Horn, who ran the largest cattle operation between Beulah Springs and the Rio Hondo, had sold 30 head in February at prices that made his jaw tighten whenever the subject came up. His neighbor to the west, Denton Marsh, had done something harder. He had sold his entire breeding herd of cows and kept only his bulls. A decision that looked like mathematics but felt like amputation. 3 smaller operations along the eastern bench had simply closed. The families loaded what they could onto wagons and pointed themselves towards Socorro or Las Cruces or somewhere that was not here, and the abandoned ranch houses they left behind had already begun the slow process of returning to the landscape, their window frames collecting dust, their doors hanging open to whatever came through. Against all of this, on 40 acres of rocky ground that climbed the face of the Saddleback Formation in a series of uneven terraces nobody had ever thought worth farming, Willa Grantham's cattle were eating. Not thriving, that word belonged to better seasons, but eating, moving, holding weight in a way that defied what the land around them looked like. From the road, if a person slowed their wagon and looked east toward the upper pasture, they could see the small dark shapes of the distributed across the hillside in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, methodical, as though the animals themselves understood something about the land they occupied. The grass up there was dry. It had been dry since August, but it was present, and that distinction, in the spring of 1884, was the difference between staying and leaving. Willa had noticed the men at the fence line on 3 separate occasions in the past 2 weeks, not stopping to speak, not calling out, just slowing their horses or their wagons as they passed the lower corner of Saddleback Ranch and looking up the slope with an expression she recognized because she had worn it herself once, years ago, in a Kansas field where something was working that she did not yet understand. She did not go down to the road to explain herself. There was nothing to explain that the land wasn't already demonstrating, and she had learned from her father that the worst thing a person could do with a good idea was talk it to death before it had time to prove itself. Elias Grantham had been a quiet man in the way that certain kinds of intelligence expresses itself through observation rather than speech. He had farmed 40 acres of hill country in western Pennsylvania for 30 years, keeping a single leather-covered notebook that he added to and revised across 3 decades. Its pages were dense with his cramped handwriting and occasional sketches of field layouts, soil profiles, root structures, and water flow patterns observed after rain. He wrote about what worked and, more carefully, about what didn't. He wrote about the difference between grass that looked good from distance and grass whose roots were deep enough to survive what was coming. He wrote about patience as a form of precision. He died in the spring of 1879, when Willa was 24, leaving her 2 things of value: a clear understanding of how land behaved when it was treated with intelligence rather than force, and the notebook itself, its cover worn soft from decades of handling, its pages carrying the particular dry scent of old knowledge and the faint smell of lamp oil from the winter evenings when he had done most of his writing. She had carried it with her to Kansas, where she spent 5 years as an assistant to a federal land survey team working the grassland country between Dodge City and the Oklahoma border. The work was methodical and often tedious, measuring elevation changes, mapping soil composition, recording vegetation types across the survey grid, but it confirmed in practical terms what her father's notebook had suggested in theory. The land had logic. It responded to treatment. Overworked grass died at the root. Rested grass came back. Water moved in patterns that could be predicted and stored if a person understood the terrain. The men she worked alongside were competent, but most of them thought of the survey as information gathering for future settlers. Willa thought of it as a curriculum. She left Kansas in 1881 and returned to New Mexico Territory, where her brother Owen was finishing his 10th year at a livestock processing operation in Dodge City and thinking hard about land of his own. Owen Grantham was 6 years older than Willa. Broad through the shoulders, deliberate in his movements, possessed of a practical competence with livestock that had been built through proximity and repetition rather than study. He knew cattle the way a good carpenter knows wood through touch, through the particular smell of an animal in distress versus an animal at ease, through the sound a herd made when it was content and the different sound it made when something was wrong. What he lacked, and knew he lacked, was the theoretical framework that would have told him why certain pastures recovered faster than others, why some water sources remained while others failed, why the land itself seemed to favor certain decisions over others. Willa had the framework. Owen had the savings $840 accumulated over a decade of steady work in difficult conditions. Together they had enough to buy one piece of land, and the only piece within reach was Saddleback Ranch. The previous owner, a man named Federley who had come to Cutter Flats from Missouri with large ideas and inadequate water, had tried to run Hereford cattle on the 40 acres for 3 years before giving up. The land was rocky, the upper terraces were hard to access with wagons. The soil was thin over caliche in places, and the vegetation that grew on the north-facing slopes was not the lush grama grass of the lower valley, but a sparse, coarse-stemmed mix of drought-adapted species that cattle tended to ignore when better options were available. Federley sold for $200 less than he had paid and did not look back. Silas Horn came by the first week the Granthams occupied the property, bringing a pan of cornbread his wife had made and the kind of advice that arrives wrapped in neighborly warmth but carries the weight of a verdict. He was a large man, gray at the temples, with a face weathered to the color and texture of old saddle leather. He had run cattle in Cutter Flats since 1849, and there was no one within 50 miles who had more practical experience with this land than he did. That experience was real and earned, and Willa respected it even as she understood that it was also the source of his certainty that she was doing everything wrong. His advice was to buy good Hereford stock, keep them near the creek bottom where the best grass grew, supplement with hay through the dry months, and not move the herd more than necessary. It was the same advice that had worked in Cutter Flats for 30 years. Owen thanked him. Willa listened carefully and asked 2 questions about soil composition near the creek bottom that Horn could not answer and that he seemed to find slightly irritating. After he left, Owen leaned against the porch rail and watched the dust of Horn's wagon settle on the road. He knows this country. He knows one way of working this country. Willa set the cornbread on the kitchen shelf. That's not the same thing. Owen looked at her for a moment, then back at the road. He had learned, over the course of their lives together in the 2 years since they had begun planning this venture, that when Willa made a distinction it was worth sitting with, rather than arguing. The auction at Pecos Valley came in March of 1884, drawing most of Cutter Flats along with ranchers from as far as Lincoln County and the Tularosa Basin. The spring sale was the region's primary livestock exchange, held in a series of wooden corrals on the south edge of Fort Sumner, and it ran for 2 days. Most of the serious buying happened in the first day's morning. Lots well-bred Hereford bulls and blooded cow-calf pairs that went for prices reflecting the confidence, however strained, of their owners. By late afternoon of the first day, the lots had declined in quality and the crowd had thinned. The lot that appeared near the end of the afternoon session was 18 head of what the auctioneer's man described, without particular enthusiasm, as range-bred cattle from a Sacramento mountain operation that had recently closed. They were small, noticeably smaller than the Herefords, and even the mixed-grade stock that had preceded them, and their condition reflected a hard winter without supplemental feed. Ribs showed. Hip bones were prominent. Their coats had the dry, rough look of animals that had been working hard for a long time with modest reward. Silas Horn was in the 4th row of the buyer's gallery when the lot entered the ring. He leaned toward Denton Marsh and said something that produced a short, dry laugh from both men. Several others in the vicinity smiled. Willa was not in the buyer's gallery. She had gone down to the holding pens an hour before the lot was scheduled to appear, moving among the animals slowly, the way her father had taught her to move in the presence of cattle without hurry, without sudden gestures, occupying space in the pen rather than intruding on it. She looked at feet first. The hooves on these animals were hard, darkened, worn in a way that indicated years of movement across rocky terrain not damaged, but shaped by difficulty into something durable. He checked legs and found them clean. No swelling, no heat, no old injuries that had healed wrong. She looked at eyes clear, steady, tracking her movement with calm attention, rather than the white-rimmed anxiety of an animal that had been badly handled or was fighting something internal. These cattle had been bred on the Sacramento slopes, which meant they had spent their lives moving up and down terrain that would have destroyed the legs of low country stock. They ate what was available, which in the mountains meant coarse native grasses, browse species, dried forbs, the kind of vegetation that a Hereford raised on valley floor grass would walk past without interest. Their digestive systems had adapted to extract nutrition from material that more specialized breeds could not process efficiently. They were small, yes, and thin from a hard season, but they were not sick, not broken, not fundamentally compromised. They were an animal built for exactly the kind of range that Saddleback Ranch presented. A cow of this size, Willa calculated, would consume roughly a third of the daily forage that a mature Hereford required. On 40 acres of scrub range in a dry year, that arithmetic was not a small consideration. Owen found her at the pen rail as the lot was being moved toward the auction ring. He looked at the animals with the careful eye of a man who had spent 10 years in the livestock business. They're thin. They've had a hard winter. Willa kept her eyes on the cattle. Look at their feet. He looked. He was quiet for a moment. They've been on rough ground their whole lives. These animals have been selecting for survival on terrain like ours for at least 2 generations, maybe more. She watched the last cow move through the gate. They eat less than a third of what a Hereford needs. They'll work ground that other cattle won't touch. In a dry year, that difference is everything. Owen studied her face. He had seen her read a piece of land or a herd of animals, the way other people read a letter, absorbing information that wasn't visible on the surface, drawing conclusions that took him several more minutes of looking to begin to approach. Are they sick? No. She turned toward the auction ring. They're waiting for the right place. He raised his hand when the bidding opened low and stayed low. The auctioneer called for more interest, with the practiced patter of a man filling time until a number materialized. When Owen's bid was the only one standing, the hammer came down, and the sound that followed from the gallery was not applause. It was the particular quality of laughter that emerges when a group of people are certain they have just witnessed an error. Willa heard it clearly. She did not turn toward the gallery. The drive back to Cutter Flats took 2 days with the cattle moving at the pace the terrain required. Owen drove them carefully, not pushing for distance, letting them graze along the road margins where anything green was available. By the time they turned up the track towards Saddleback Ranch, Willa had the first section of the rotation system in her mind with the clarity of something she had been planning for months, because she had been. She spread the survey map on the kitchen table that evening, a federal land survey document from 1878, obtained through her contacts at the survey office in Santa Fe, detailed enough to show elevation changes, drainage patterns, and approximate soil compositions across the 40 acres. On its reverse side, using a pencil she kept sharp for the purpose, she drew the division, 7 sections, each one configured to follow the natural contours of the terrain, taking into account drainage, shade, water access, and the distribution of vegetation types. The cattle would rotate through the sections on a schedule, no section grazed for more than 3 weeks, each section resting for a minimum of 6 weeks before the herd returned to it. The rest periods were not idleness. They were the operative mechanism of the entire system. Grass needed time after grazing to rebuild its root mass, to push energy downward before pushing it upward again. Land that was continuously grazed lost that root mass incrementally, season by season, until what remained on the surface was the skeleton of a pasture present, technically, but without the subsurface structure that would allow it to survive drought, hold moisture, or recover from disturbance. Her father had written about this in the notebook, describing what he had observed on a neighbor's farm in Pennsylvania, overstocked for 20 years. The ground looked like ground. The grass looked like grass. But pull a handful and examine the roots, and you would find them shallow, fragile, anchored in an inch of topsoil over a hard pan that rain ran off rather than soaking into. The neighbor lost his entire pasture in a dry summer that Willa Grantham's fields survived without notable difficulty. The difference was not the weather. The weather was identical for both farms. The difference was what lived under the surface. Owen built the fence lines over 2 weeks of hard work, setting posts in the rocky soil, with a bar and patience, stringing wire in the cold March mornings, while Willa walked each section to assess the vegetation and add notes to the survey map's margin. Cattle moved through the first section without complaint, working the coarse grasses that grew between the rocks with a quiet efficiency that Owen watched with visible interest. They did not pace the fence lines looking for better. They grazed what was in front of them. Silas Horn came by on a Thursday afternoon, arriving up the track in his wagon with the unhurried manner of a man who has no particular urgency because his situation has not yet reached the point of requiring it. He was invited in for coffee, declined, but stood at the corner of the first fence line and looked at the division of pasture with an expression that did not commit itself to opinion. He asked Owen about the water situation on the upper sections. Owen showed him the shallow tanks they had scraped out below the natural drainage lines, hand-dug basins lined with clay to slow the percolation, positioned to capture what came off the slope after rain. Horn looked at them without speaking. On his way back to the wagon, he paused at the fence corner and looked at the herd working the first section. He did not say anything until he had gathered his reins. Lot of work for 40 acres. Owen kept his voice easy. We're managing what we have. Horn nodded once and drove back down the track. He told his wife that evening that the Grantham operation was going to be an education in how not to run a cattle ranch in Cutter Flats, and that the education would come at a price neither of the Granthams could afford. The winter of 1883-84 had come and gone without delivering what the season owed. What it did deliver, in the absence of snow and cold season moisture, was a test of the feed calculation Willa had made at the auction. The mountain-bred cattle moved through the first section, then the second, working the dry native grasses with methodical contentment, while Owen monitored the forage levels and Willa tracked consumption in her notebook. The number she had estimated held. These animals were consuming roughly 35% less than a comparable number of Hereford cattle would have required. The savings in supplemental hay were measurable and significant enough to keep the operating budget intact when Silas Horne's operation had already begun spending heavily on purchased feed. April arrived with the particular light of high desert spring, thin and brilliant, and with it came the calves. 10 of them, born across a span of 3 weeks, all healthy, all on their feet within hours of birth. The cattle had been pregnant at the time of the auction, visibly so, to a careful eye, though no one in the buyer's gallery had been looking carefully enough. Owen stood in the calving pen the morning the 5th calf was born and watched it find its footing on the straw-covered ground, watched it locate its mother without fumbling, watched the cow turn and nose it with the grave, attentive manner of an animal that knew exactly what she was doing. He did not say anything that could have been written down. But Willa, who had come out at dawn to check the pen, saw his face and understood. The calves were small, as their mothers were small, but they were sound. Their legs were straight, their eyes were clear. They nursed with the aggression of animals with good constitutions and adequate supply, growing with a steadiness the notebook's daily observations confirmed, and the eye could track across weeks. By May, news from the South had begun arriving in pieces, the way bad news tends to travel first in rumor, then in the language of the men who move between communities, carrying goods and information in approximately equal measure. A freighter passing through Beulah Springs on his way to Roswell mentioned that 3 ranches south of Carrizozo had already sold down to survival numbers. Another man, a cattle buyer working the region for a Fort Worth firm, stopped at the feed store to ask about available stock and mentioned numbers, prices, weight averages, the particular vocabulary of a market adjusting rapidly to reduce supply. Silas Horne organized a meeting at Beulah Springs in the 3rd week of May. He sent word to the 7 largest operations in the district, which meant Owen Grantham received an invitation. The meeting was held in the back room of Caldwell's dry goods store, which smelled of burlap and lamp oil, and the particular tension of men sitting together with shared problems they had not yet agreed on how to discuss. Owen took the only seat left when he arrived, against the wall near the back, and he listened to an hour of conversation about water rights, grazing reduction strategies, the price trajectory of hay from Las Cruces, and the question of whether the Territorial Cattle Association might make representations to the Federal Land Office about emergency range access. Willa's name did not come up once. The conversation proceeded as though Saddleback Ranch were not a part of Cutter Flats, as though the operation that had managed to come through the driest winter in a decade without selling stock or purchasing supplemental feed at crisis prices did not exist and had no information to offer. Owen did not force the subject. He listened, noted what was said and what wasn't, and drove home in the early evening with the kind of measured anger that doesn't express itself in volume. He told Willa about the meeting while she was writing up the day's observations. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she set down her pencil and looked at the section of the notebook she had been working on, a sketch of the root depth comparison she had made by pulling samples from sections 1 and 3, showing the difference between grazed and rested ground after only 1 rotation cycle. Did Horne ask about our feed bills? No. Did anyone? She picked up her pencil. Then we keep working. The summer descended on Cutter Flats with the particular quality of heat that arrives when a dry winter has already stressed the land and the spring has offered nothing to compensate. June brought temperatures that shimmered the air above the road by 10 in the morning and did not relent until well after dark. The water in the shallow tanks below the drainage lines dropped but did not disappear. The clay lining was holding. The positioning on the slope capturing whatever moisture the brief afternoon cloud shadows occasionally released. The creek remained stone and dust. The cattle on the valley floor ranches were beginning to show condition loss that their owners discussed in the careful language of men not yet ready to call what they were seeing by its right name. Willa moved the herd into Section 4 in late June, leaving Sections 2 and 3 in rest. Walking Section 3 one morning to assess the recovery, she found something that stopped her, a thread of green at the base of a clump of tobosa grass, new growth pushing up through the dry thatch, invisible from standing height, present only because the roots beneath it were alive enough to respond to the minimal moisture the clay-lined tanks were metering into the ground. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of thing that would have looked like anything to most observers. To Willa, it was confirmation of a principle her father had written about in 1871, in a passage she had read so many times she could have recited it from memory. The root survives the surface. When the surface looks dead, look deeper. She did not tell Owen about the green thread that morning. She wrote it in the notebook. measured the clump, noted the soil moisture at root depth, and continued her assessment. Some things needed to be documented before they were discussed. The rumors started sometime in July. She heard about them first from Agnes Caldwell, the woman who ran the dry goods section at her husband's store, a practical, clear-eyed woman who had been a reliable source of information about the community's temper for as long as Willa had been in Cutter Flats. Agnes mentioned, in the way that careful people mention things they are not endorsing, that there was talk about where the Granthams were getting their hay. The consensus forming at the feed store and the post office was that Owen must be hauling supplemental feed from Roswell in the hours before dawn, before anyone on the road would see him. This explained the cattle's condition. It also explained, in the logic of the narrative, why the Granthams kept to themselves and didn't discuss their operation at community meetings. They were concealing something. Denton Marsh had contributed materially to this version of events. He was not a malicious man. Precisely, he was a frightened one, which in certain situations produces the same outcomes. He had sold his breeding herd in April to avoid losing them to the drought, and by July he had begun to understand that the decision had consequences that would not resolve themselves quickly. Without breeding stock, recovery would require purchasing replacements at whatever price the market demanded when the drought ended. He was looking at a gap of years, not months. When a man in that position sees a neighbor's cattle eating well on 40 rocky acres, the easiest available explanation is one that preserves the dignity of his own decision. Agnes told Willa what was being said with the directness of a woman who considered honest information a form of courtesy. She mentioned Marsh by name, noted that Silas Horn had not actively promoted the story, but had not contradicted it either, and suggested that the simplest resolution would be to invite people to come and look at the operation themselves. Willa considered this on the ride home. She understood the logic. She also understood that there was a difference between transparency and capitulation, and that inviting scrutiny in response to a rumor put the burden of proof in the wrong place. The land was demonstrating the truth of what she was doing every day. A person who wanted to know could look at it. The fact that most people preferred a story that made their own choices look less costly was not a problem she could solve by opening her gate. She wrote Agnes Caldwell's information in the margin of the day's page and continued working. The heat in the third week of July produced something Willa had not fully calculated for. It made the fence repair on the upper sections urgent. Posts she and Owen had set in the spring had dried out differently in the July furnace. Several of the upper section posts, set in ground now contracting as the moisture left it, had worked loose enough to create a gap risk in the fence line between sections 5 and 6. If the cattle moved through a gap into section 5 before the recovery schedule permitted, it would set back the rest period by weeks and compromise the root regrowth she had already observed beginning there. Owen spent 3 days in the last week of July on the fence line, working in the early morning hours before the heat peaked and returning to it in the late afternoon when it had begun, slightly, to relent. The ground on the upper terrace was hard as fired clay, and resetting posts required the bar and a full-body effort that showed in how he moved by evening. On the third day, working the section 5 line in the afternoon, he came down off the terrace at a wrong angle on a surface of loose shale the drought had dried to ball-bearing looseness. His right boot went one way. His forearm came down against the fence post as he caught himself. Willa heard it from the lower tank, a short, controlled sound that was not a cry but was not silence either. She was up the slope in 2 minutes. Owen was sitting against the post he had been resetting, his right arm cradled against his body, his face the careful, deliberate blankness of a person deciding how bad something is before allowing themselves a reaction. It was the forearm, not the wrist, which had been her first fear, but the radius, 2/3 of the way up. She could feel the discontinuity through the sleeve without pressing hard enough to cause more damage. She had set enough broken bones on animals to know the difference between a crack and a full fracture, and this was the latter. The doctor in Beulah Springs was a man named Pruitt, who had been practicing in the territory for 15 years, and who set the bone with the efficient compression of someone for whom this procedure had become routine. He made a splint from basswood strips and linen wrapping, told Owen the arm needed 6 weeks of immobility, and charged $2 for the visit. Owen paid without expression. On the road home, they drove in silence for a mile before Owen looked at the splinted arm resting in his lap and said the only thing about it he would ever say directly. "I need to be useful." Willa kept her eyes on the road. "You will be." She meant it differently than he understood it at the time. What she meant was that the most useful thing Owen Grantham could do for the next 6 weeks was be present, be steady, and trust her. What he heard was reassurance, which was also true, but was the smaller of the two meanings. The adjustment to working alone was not dramatic because Willa did not allow it to be. She restructured the daily schedule around what one person could accomplish efficiently, eliminating tasks that required 2 sets of hands until they could be deferred or redesigned, concentrating the physical work in the cooler hours, adding the notebook observations to the early morning rotation so that the data continued without interruption. Owen managed what he could with one arm: the feeding calculations, the water level readings from the lower tanks, which he could reach without climbing, and he watched what she was doing with the focused attention of a man who has been told to rest and cannot. She moved the herd from Section 6 to Section 1 in the first week of August. Section 1 was the lowest of the 7, closest to the creek bed, and it had been resting the longest 12 weeks, the longest rest period in the system's first full cycle. Walking it the morning before she brought the cattle in, Willa found what 12 weeks had produced, root systems that had sent new growth downward rather than up. Visible as a slight resistance in the soil when she pushed her fingers into the ground. The surface looked similar to the other sections. Below the surface, the difference was significant. She brought the cattle in before first light, moving them through the gate before the heat could make the movement stressful. They settled into the section with the unhurried thoroughness of animals that had learned to trust the quality of what was being offered. It was a Tuesday when the pump stopped. She heard it in the silence, not a sound, but the absence of one. The pump that drew from the main well served the drinking trough in the holding pen adjacent to Section 1, and she had become so habituated to its presence as background noise that her attention registered its absence before her conscious mind had identified what had changed. She put down the notebook and walked to the pump house. The mechanism was a single-cylinder piston pump, iron-framed, driven by a wind wheel that Owen had repaired the previous autumn. The wind wheel was turning. The linkage connecting it to the pump cylinder was intact. The problem was inside the cylinder. She pulled the pump rod. The leather piston cup came up wet and useless, the hide so dried and cracked along its circumference that it had ceased to make a seal against the cylinder wall. Without the seal, the pump moved air instead of water. She stood in the pump house with the failed piston cup in her hand and did the arithmetic the situation required. The stock tank held approximately 400 gallons when full. It was currently perhaps a third full 130 gallons. The herd of 18 adults and 10 calves required in this heat somewhere between 8 and 10 gallons per animal per day. At the high end, that was 280 gallons daily. The tank had perhaps 20 hours of water remaining. The leather needed for the piston cup was a specific weight and flexibility, not saddle leather, not harness leather, but the particular cut used in pump mechanism seals. Beulah Springs did not carry it. The nearest supplier was in Roswell, a 2-day round trip by wagon. Owen was sitting on the porch when she came down from the pump house. She told him what had happened without preamble, then the arithmetic. He looked at the splinted arm. He looked at the pump house. He looked at the sky, which offered nothing useful. Horn, he said. She had already been thinking about it. Silas Horn had been running the largest operation in Cutter Flats for 35 years, which meant he had accumulated, in the shed and lean-to structures behind his main house, the archaeological record of 3.5 decades of equipment repair-worn parts, replaced mechanisms, the particular category of functional component that was too good to discard but no longer needed on its original machine. A man like that had a pump history. She did not ask Owen to go. His arm was useless for driving, and the road to Horn's place had a crossing that required both hands on the reins. She unhitched the saddle horse from the post, put the failed piston cup in her coat pocket, and rode east. Silas Horn was in his equipment shed when she arrived, working with a chain harness that required concentration. He heard her horse and came to the shed door with the look of a man mildly surprised by what he finds, but not extravagantly so. Willa did not dismount. She pulled the failed piston cup from her pocket and held it out. I need to know if you have anything compatible with this. Our pump failed this morning. We have 20 hours of water in the tank. He took the piston cup, turned it over, examined the diameter, the rod hole dimension, the specific deterioration pattern of the leather along the seal edge. His expression was the careful examination of a man measuring something against knowledge he is not yet certain applies. How deep is your well? 42 feet. He turned the cup again. Then he went into the shed without saying anything further, and she heard the particular sound of a man moving through organized storage, systematic, purposeful, going somewhere specific. He was gone 11 minutes by the position of the sun when he came back. In his hand was a piston cup visibly similar to the failed one in diameter, and leather preparation, slightly thicker at the rim, pulled from a pump decommissioned 4 years ago when he had replaced it with a larger mechanism. Might need some fitting. He held it alongside the failed cup. The rod diameter looks close. I can fit it. She reached down for it. He held it a moment longer, not withholding measuring. You know, it might not seat right on the first draw. I know how to pack the seal if it doesn't. He let her take it. She turned the horse. Behind her, she heard him say something at the volume of a man addressing himself as much as the departing rider. Come get me if the fitting doesn't hold. She rode back at a pace the horse could sustain and still cover the ground fast. Owen had the pump rod laid out on the work table by the time she returned, the cylinder cap removed with his one good hand and a pry tool braced against the table edge. She looked at what he had managed and said nothing about it, because the useful response was to take up from where he had gotten rather than comment on how he had gotten there. The fitting took 2 hours. The new cup was 0.4 of an inch wider in diameter than the cylinder bore, which was the right direction for error. It would compress to seal rather than allowing slippage. She packed the seal edge with rendered tallow, which Owen held the container of with his splinted arm while she worked. The rod went back in. Cap went on. She reconnected the linkage. The wind wheel began to drive the mechanism. The pump made the sound it was supposed to make, a rhythmic, pressured draw. distinct from the hollow movement of air that had told her the seal was gone. Owen held his hand at the outlet pipe. Water arrived. Not immediately, not spectacularly. It came in the measured way of a mechanism doing what it was built to do. He looked at the water running over his fingers. He did not say anything. They were finishing the cleanup when they heard the wagon on the lower track. Silas Horn pulled up to the gatepost in the last good light of the afternoon, his face carrying the expression of a man who had told himself he was just checking, but who had actually been thinking about this since the rider left his yard. He saw the water running into the stock tank through the outlet pipe. He watched it for a moment. You got it seated. First draw. Willa was wiping the tallow from her hands with a rag. The diameter was close enough. Horn climbed down from the wagon with the deliberateness of a man whose joints had their own opinion about such transitions. He walked to the tank outlet and put his hand in the flow the way people do when they want to confirm that a thing is real. Then he looked at Willa, at Owen's splinted arm, at the pump house, at the herd in Section 1, moving toward the tank in the easy way of cattle that expect what they are moving toward to be there. He took off his hat. He turned it in his hands once. He put it back on. How long has his arm been set? 12 days. And you've been running this alone. It was not a question, so she did not answer it as one. She went back to cleaning the tallow from the pump rod. Horn stood by the tank for a few minutes. The sun was going behind the ridge to the west, the temperature beginning its nightly drop, that high desert quality of air that releases its heat the moment the light changes, as though warmth were a property of the sun alone and not of anything it had touched. Those calves, he said finally, looking at the Section 1 herd. They're filling out. They're on their third rotation cycle. The forage in one has had 12 weeks of rest. He watched the calves a moment longer. 10 of them, clustered near the tank with the easy confidence of young animals that had grown up in a place and did not know it was supposed to be difficult. Not the size of Hereford calves at the same age, smaller, compact but bright-eyed, straight-legged, moving with a sureness that came from adequate nutrition delivered consistently over time. Horn set his hat back on his head with the finality of a man concluding something. I'll be getting home. He climbed back into the wagon. Willa walked with him to the gatepost, not because courtesy required it, but because she wanted to see his face when he looked back at the Section 1 pasture from the road. He looked back. His expression was the one she had learned to read on careful men not converted, not convinced, but recalculating. The expression of someone who has found that the information they are working with may not be complete. He drove east without turning again. August arrived and did not bring any revision to the verdict the summer had been delivering. The temperatures held. The sky continued its performance of clouds that meant nothing. The water in the tanks continued to drop, more slowly since the pump repair, not slowly enough to stop being a number Willa watched with focused attention. She moved the herd from Section 1 to Section 3 in the second week of August, Section 3 having now completed its 9-week rest period, the longest uninterrupted rest in the system to date. Walking it the morning before the move, she found what 9 weeks had produced, plants that had not only survived but had sent lateral runners into adjacent bare spots, colonizing slowly the gaps that overgrazing had created. It was the landscape doing what it would always do if given time, moving incrementally toward density and the interlocking root mass that held water in the soil instead of letting it sheet off. The news from the wider region arrived in pieces through August, each piece slightly worse than the one before. A stockman from Chaves County came through Beulah Springs and reported that the Rio Hondo had stopped running above the Picacho crossing. 3 more ranches between Carrizozo and Capitan had sold, completely not downsizing but ending. A family named Brewer, who had homesteaded the bench north of Beulah Springs 6 years earlier, loaded 2 wagons on a Thursday and were gone by Saturday. Their house standing open in the way of all the other houses the drought had emptied. Denton Marsh came by Caldwell's store in the second week of August and did not find the conversation he seemed to have come looking for. Agnes Caldwell was civil, as she was with everyone, but there was a quality in her civility that communicated a completed assessment. Marsh bought flour and tobacco and left. He did not revisit the subject of how the Granthams were running their operation. At Saddleback Ranch, the daily structure held. Willa was up before first light, completing the tank readings before the heat made the walk to the upper sections unpleasant, managing the herd movement, writing in the notebook, making the small constant decisions a working system required. Whether a particular animal was showing stress that warranted closer monitoring, whether a section's forage was depleting faster than projected and needed an early rotation, whether the tallow packing in the pump seal was holding. Owen worked what he could manage and watched what he could not, and there was a quality in his watching that Willa felt, without needing to discuss, not helplessness, because Owen Grantham was not built for helplessness, but a focused observation that was accumulating something she did not yet have a name for. On a Tuesday evening in the third week of August, Owen came in from the lower tank. With a reading, he wrote on the margin of the kitchen table with his thumbnail, the habit he had developed for numbers he wanted to remember before reaching the notebook. We're down to 14 inches in the lower. Willa looked up from the notebook. 14 inches was not critical, but it was the number that sat below the margin she preferred to maintain. How's 3 holding? Better than 2 was when we left it. I think the roots are doing what you said they would. She looked at what the thumbnail mark represented in terms of weeks, in terms of what the sky was continuing to not provide. I'm going to walk 5 tomorrow morning. If the recovery is where I think it is, we can move to 5 early and give 3 another 2 weeks. Owen was quiet for a moment. That's ahead of schedule. The schedule is a starting point. She closed the notebook. The land tells me when to revise. He looked at her with the long, considered look of a man who has been watching someone work for long enough to understand that what he is watching is not ordinary, even when it looks ordinary from the outside. Dad would have liked this place. It was the first time either of them had mentioned their father since arriving in Cutter Flats, and the precision of the moment, the heat outside, the failing margins, the notebook on the table between them gave the words a weight that a different occasion would not have produced. Willa did not answer immediately. She looked at the notebook's cover, the worn leather that was her father's and was now hers. He would have had opinions about the tank placement. Owen's mouth moved in the Grantham version of a laugh. He would have been right about some of them. Probably. She picked up the notebook, went to bed, lay in the dark listening to the land, which was still doing what she had asked of it, slowly, without drama, against conditions that argued against the possibility. The last week of August delivered the worst 3 days of the summer, a sequence of afternoons that pushed past anything the season had previously produced. The air so dry it cracked lip skin and made breathing feel like an inhalation of fine sand. The cattle in Section 3 moved less during the peak hours, standing in the partial shade of the ridge where it crossed the section's upper corner, their heads low. They were not distress, and cattle looked specific and identifiable. And this was not it, but they were conserving, the way animals conserve when they have learned that the conditions require it. The pump held. The tank levels stabilized below where Willa preferred them. The herd held its condition. On the morning of the 28th, Willa walked Section 5. What she found confirmed the revision she had been considering. 9 weeks of uninterrupted rest had allowed the section's native grasses to accomplish something she measured by pulling 12 sample clusters at even intervals across the section. In 9 of 12, the root depth had increased by a measurable amount, not dramatic, not the kind of thing that would show in a photograph, but present in the data, consistent, the land answering the question the rotation system had been asking of it. She moved the herd to Section 5 that evening. Walking back to the house in the last light, she passed the lower tank and checked the stick reading. The number was better than the previous morning, not significantly, but directionally. The pump was maintaining. The seal was holding. She wrote the Section 5 observations in the notebook, added the tank reading, noted the temperature peak. On the facing page, her father's handwriting was visible through the thin paper, a passage from 1873, written in the Pennsylvania winter, about the patience required to manage land through a dry cycle without losing what made it productive. She turned the page and wrote the date at the top of the next clean column. September came in on a shift of wind that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. The temperature dropped 4 degrees from its August peak, a loosening of the air, a slight easing in the quality of light during the late afternoon hours. It did not mean rain. Willa had learned that lesson in Kansas, where the autumn wind shift was a reliable meteorological event that carried no necessary relationship to precipitation. But it changed the arithmetic of daily water consumption in the herd, reduced the thermal stress on the grasses in Section 5, and gave Willa 2 additional weeks of margin in the tank projections she had been revising each morning. Owen's splint came off in the first week of September, removed by Pruitt in Beulah Springs, with the same efficient matter-of-factness that had characterized its installation. The bone had knit cleanly. He told Owen to expect reduced grip strength for 4 to 6 weeks and to avoid full rotational force on the wrist for 2 months. Owen listened with the expression of a man already calculating what he could do tomorrow. He started the next morning with the fence repair on Section 6 that had been deferred since the injury. Willa watched from a distance, not monitoring but present, the way you are present near something you care about without wanting to appear to care. His movements were careful. He favored the arm without making a performance of it. By noon, he had reset 3 posts, modest progress by his normal standard, and exactly right progress by the standard of a bone 6 weeks from its break. The news from the region in September confirmed what the previous months had been suggesting and accumulating evidence. At a territorial cattlemen's meeting in Roswell that Owen attended, the numbers were spoken aloud for the first time in an organized setting. Chavs, Lincoln, and Doña Ana counties had collectively reduced their cattle inventory by an estimated 40% since the previous spring. The hay market had moved to prices that made supplemental feeding economically ruinous for operations that had not budgeted for it at those levels. 3 banks in the territory had sent letters to ranching clients requesting meetings about loan security. Owen came home from Roswell with this information and with something else, a specific price quote from a cattle buyer working the regional sale yards for a Fort Worth firm. The drought-driven reduction in cattle numbers across the territory had created a supply gap that would persist for at least 2 years. The buyer estimated, as herds that had been sold down or eliminated entirely required time to rebuild. Whatever well-conditioned calves were available would move at prices reflecting scarcity rather than the ordinary value of the animal. The number the buyer had quoted for 8-month mountain-bred calves of the quality Owen described was 41% above the same period the previous year. Willa heard this number at the kitchen table and wrote it in the margin of the notebook page she was working on. She looked at the 10 calves in her current count, 8 of them males, all approaching the age and condition the buyer had described. He wants to know if we're selling. Tell him we'll be at the Pecos Valley auction in October. Owen looked at her, at the number in the margin, at the calves visible through the window. All 8 males? 8 males. He was quiet a moment. That's most of the calf crop. We keep the 2 best heifers for the breeding herd. The rest goes at this market. She closed the notebook with the decisiveness of someone who has already done the calculation and arrived at the answer before the conversation began. The drought won't last forever. When it ends, the supply gap is our position. We need cash now to hold it. He looked at the numbers she had written. He looked at the calves. He did not argue because the logic was complete and he recognized completeness when he encountered it. The sale at Pecos Valley in mid-October was the first Willa had attended since the previous spring's auction where she had purchased the herd. The atmosphere was different in a way that went beyond the seasonal change. There was a specific quality in a cattle sale when the sellers outnumber the motivated buyers at tightening, a careful performance of indifference among men watching prices with the concentrated attention of people whose futures were calibrated to fractions. But there was also, this October sale, something working in the opposite direction. The supply contraction Owen had heard about in Roswell was present here in the form of empty pens and thin lot numbers and buyers from Fort Worth and Kansas City who had come expecting volume and found scarcity. The Fort Worth buyer found Owen at the pens before the auction opened. He looked at the 8 calves with the professional attention of someone who has examined thousands and can extract significant information from a 30-second assessment. He checked feet, legs, the depth of body relative to frame size, mountain-bred, Sacramento slope stock, 2nd generation on our range. The buyer looked at the calves again. They're small. They'll be small their whole lives. Owen met the man's eyes without adjustment. They'll also still be eating when the valley floor cattle have been sold off for the 3rd time. The buyer offered a number. Owen told him the auction would set the price. The buyer smiled the way men smile when they intend to be at the auction and are simply opening a conversation. The calves went in the 3rd lot of the afternoon. The bidding opened at a number that reflected the general market and moved in a direction that reflected the specific scarcity. When the hammer came down, the price per head was 38% above the previous year's comparable sale. 8 calves at that number, minus the buyer's commission, produced a figure that Willa wrote in the notebook that evening, with the deliberateness of someone recording a fact that matters, $219. The operating cost for Saddleback Ranch across 22 months had been $193. She looked at the arithmetic for a long time before she closed the notebook. Not because the surplus was large, $26 above costs. After 22 months of daily labor in conditions that had broken operations 10 times the size of theirs, but because it was positive. In a season that had emptied houses and closed gates across Cutter Flats, Saddleback Ranch had finished above zero. The margin was thin enough to disappear into a single bad decision. It was also real, earned, and fully deserved. Owen cooked that evening, something he did only on occasions he considered significant, producing a meal from ingredients they had been careful with for weeks that became, in his hands, more than the sum of its components. They ate without much conversation. The silence between them had the quality of a thing completed rather than a thing withheld. Silas Horn came on a Saturday morning in the first week of November. He came without announcement, driving up the track in the gray early light of a cool morning, his wagon carrying nothing but himself. Willa was at the lower tank when she heard the wagon and turned to watch it come. She noted the time of morning too early for a social call, too deliberate for a man simply passing by. She went to meet him at the gatepost. He climbed down with the deliberateness of a man managing something internal that required more care than his joints. He stood at the gatepost and looked up the slope towards Section 1, where the herd was beginning to move in the morning light, spreading through the section with the distributed pattern that characterized their grazing behavior. He looked at this for a long time. Willa stood beside the gatepost and let him look. The grass in Section 1. He did not take his eyes from the upper slope. When did it come back like that? It's been coming back since we gave it the first 12-week rest in the spring. This is the 3rd rotation cycle. Each rest period has produced more recovery than the one before it. He turned to look at her directly. It was the look of a man who has prepared a speech and has found, on arrival, that the speech is both necessary and insufficient. I told Edna you had a system. She asked me if I'd told you that. A pause. I hadn't. Willa waited. I was wrong about this operation. He said it the way a precise man says a thing he has measured before speaking, not as confession, not as performance, but as correction of a record that required it. I've been wrong before. I'm not so old I can't say so. You came at 11 o'clock at night in August with a pump fitting that saved this herd. Willa kept her voice level. That's not the action of a man who had written us off entirely. Something in his face shifted the specific expression of a person who has been offered something they did not expect to receive and are not certain yet how to hold. That fitting had been in my shed for 4 years. I'd forgotten about it. I hadn't counted on it. He turned back to the slope. The 2 heifers retained from the sale, along with 3 calves born in the October cycle from the second breeding, were visible along the upper fence line, moving with the purposefulness of animals raised in a working landscape. He watched them for a moment. "What you did here," he said finally, "is not what I would have done. The rotation, the breed selection, none of it is what 35 years in this valley taught me." He picked up his hat brim, held it, set it back without putting it on. "I've been trying to figure out if I'm too old to learn what you know." Willa looked at him, at the weathered specificity of a face that had been working in this landscape since before she was born, that carried knowledge she did not have and never would, because it lived in the accumulated experience of 3.5 decades that no survey or notebook could fully replace. "You know this valley in ways I don't." She meant it without qualification. The drainage patterns below the bench, the way the wind moves through the Saddleback Formation in different seasons, what the grass looked like before the drought of 1867, that's in you, not in any document I've read. A pause. "What I know and what you know aren't the same thing. They're not competing." He considered this with the genuine attention of a man who processes information he intends to act on rather than simply acknowledge. "My son has been talking about the rotation system. He wants to divide the east pasture." "How many acres?" 80. "Mostly valley floor, some bench. If the soil below the bench has enough depth over the caliche, the recovery rate should be faster than what you see here. Valley floor grass roots deeper." She looked at the slope. "He should start with 4 sections, not 7. The transition needs to be manageable." Horn nodded slowly. "He'll want to talk to you. He knows where the ranch is." Owen came down from the house then, having seen Horn's wagon from the kitchen window, and given the conversation the time it needed. He came through the gate and put his hand out. Horn shook at the firm, undemonstrative handshake of men who have worked in the same landscape and understand what that means without requiring it to be articulated. "Your arm," Horn said, noting the absence of the splint. 6 weeks ago, Owen moved his wrist to demonstrate the range of recovery. "Pruitt does clean work." Horn looked at the herd again, at the calves, at the condition of the Section 1 grass into its 4th week of the current grazing period, showing the kind of measured depletion that indicated a system working correctly. Not stripped, not wasted, used with precision. "Those calves at the October sale," Horn said. The Fort Worth buyer asked about the herd origin. "I heard about it from Alderman at the feed store." Owen looked at Willa. Willa kept her eyes on the herd. "He found us. What did you get?" Owen told him the price per head. Horn's reaction was the controlled absence of reaction that certain numbers produce in experienced cattlemen, the stillness of a man recalculating backward from an outcome to the decisions that produced it. In this market. Horn put his hat back on with the finality of a decision made. "I'll send my boy over this week, if that suits." "Anytime," Will said. He turned the wagon, drove down the track, did not look back, which was itself a kind of statement, the forward-facing posture of a man who has finished one thing and moved to the next. Owen stood at the gatepost until the wagon reached the road. He looked at the dust it left. That took something out of him to say. It took something. He said it anyway. Willa unlatched the gatepost chain. "That's the more important part." Young Thomas Horn came 4 days later, riding rather than driving, which told Willa he was there to look and ask rather than to negotiate or commit. He was 26 or 27, with his father's deliberateness, but a face still capable of expressing uncertainty without treating it as a vulnerability. He had a notebook of his own, smaller than Willa's, newer, with the unmarked quality of an object waiting to be used for something real. She took him through the system in the order that made logical sense, starting with the section map and explaining the design principles before walking him through the sections in their current rotation state. He asked good questions, questions that indicated he was listening rather than waiting for his turn to speak, and he wrote in the notebook with the focused economy of someone who knows that written information survives memory. At Section 3, in its 7th week of rest, he crouched at the base of a tubosa clump and pushed his fingers into the soil, reading the moisture differential at root depth versus surface. "It's wetter down here. The root mass is holding what the surface releases." She crouched beside him. "Pull that clump." He pulled it. The roots came out deeper than the surrounding bare soil would have suggested. He turned the clump over and looked at it with the concentrated attention of a person seeing a familiar material in an unfamiliar configuration. "Our east pasture has been continuous grazing since my grandfather broke it." "I know." He looked at her. "Can it recover?" "Everything with living roots in it can recover if you give it time and don't ask it to do 2 things at once." She took the clump from him and pressed it back into its hole, settling the soil around the base. "The question is whether you have the patience for the first 2 years, when the rested sections look thin and the grazed sections look fine. The rested sections are winning. It takes a while before you can see it." He looked at the clump she had replaced. "My father said you told him the knowledge isn't competing. It isn't. He knows things about the east pasture that I don't know and can't know. The drainage behavior, the soil variation, where the grass has always come back fastest after a hard year. That's in him from 35 years of watching." She stood. "What I have is a framework for using what he knows more precisely. Neither one works as well without the other." Thomas Horn wrote in his notebook. He stayed through the afternoon, walking sections 4 and 5, watching the herd move through section 1's lower corner, asking about the clay-lined tanks and the drainage positioning. When he left, he thanked her with a directness that did not perform gratitude but conveyed it accurately. She told him to come back when he had questions about dividing the east pasture. Came back in 4 days. Denton Marsh came on a Wednesday in the 3rd week of November, unannounced. On foot, he had ridden partway and tied his horse at the lower gate rather than driving up to the house. It was a small signal that Willa noticed and interpreted correctly. A man who ties his horse at the gate rather than riding to the door has not fully committed to the visit and wants to be able to leave without the social transaction that a wagon turning around in a yard requires. She was at the water tank in section 2 when she saw him coming up the track. She stayed where she was and let him come to her. He was a man who had aged noticeably since the spring, not in the ordinary way that weather and work age people, but in the specific way that a wrong decision ages you when its consequences are living in your house. Breeding herd he had sold in April would have cost him 40% more to replace today than it had been worth when he sold it. He would not replace it this year, possibly not next year. The mathematical reality of that decision had settled into his face with the permanent quality of something that was not going to leave. Stopped a few feet from the tank. He looked at the water level. He looked at the pump house. He looked at the herd. In section 2, the cattle working the native grasses with their characteristic distributed patience. I said things. He opened without preamble. In the spring and summer. About how you were running this place. He kept his eyes on the cattle. They weren't true. I made them up because it was easier than looking at my own situation. Willa set the measuring stick down against the tank wall. I know. Agnes Caldwell told me you knew. A pause. She wasn't gentle about it. Agnes is accurate. That's better than gentle. He turned from the cattle to look at her for the first time since he had come up the track. He was a man looking for something and not sure what it was or whether it was available. I'm not asking for anything. He stopped. Tried again. I watched what you've done here this summer. I watched it and I kept telling myself there was something I was missing, some hidden advantage. But there wasn't, was there? There was one advantage. She looked at the herd. We made decisions based on what we expected the land to do, not what we hoped it would do. That's not hidden. It's just not comfortable. He was quiet with that for a moment. The November light was coming in at the low angle of late autumn, cutting across the slope at a direction that made the grass visible in its three-dimensional reality, not flat cover but individual plants with height and spacing, and the particular quality of vegetation managed toward density rather than exhaustion. Thomas Horn says, you're helping them divide the east pasture. He's been here twice. He asks good questions. Marsh looked at the section 2 fence line, at the way the posts were set in relation to the drainage contour. It was the look of a man beginning to see a structure that had been invisible to him before, not because it was hidden, but because he had not been looking for it. I've got 60 acres on the bench that I didn't sell because no one wanted bench land in a drought. He looked at her. Would you look at it? Willa considered him the damaged dignity, the real question underneath the stated one. The fact that he had walked his horse to the lower gate rather than riding up, which was a kind of honesty even if it was an unconscious one. Bring a survey if you have one. Come before noon. He nodded. He turned back toward the lower gate without drawing out the leave-taking, which she respected. Halfway down the track, he stopped and turned once more. The words came out clearly, without decoration. I'm sorry for what I said. For putting it around town. She held his look for a moment. Come with the survey map. He turned and walked on. She watched him reach the gate, untie his horse, ride out without looking back. Then she picked up the measuring stick and finished the tank reading and wrote the number in the notebook. The first real rain came in the last week of November. Not the thin scatter that had passed for moisture in the intervening months, but a 2-day event that soaked into the ground with the patient thoroughness of water finding its way to roots that had been waiting for it. It was not enough to replenish the creek, not enough to refill the catch basins to their designed capacity, but it was real, and it went in, and the land responded with the specific aliveness of a thing that has been ready. The morning after the second day of rain, Willa walked all 7 sections before breakfast. What she found in the sections that had completed full rest cycles was different in kind from what the sections under shorter rest periods showed. In sections 1, 3, and 5, those with the longest uninterrupted rest, the moisture was present at root depth in a way that the surface soil of sections 2 and 4 was already releasing. The root mass in the rested sections was holding what fell, slowing its movement downward, extending the period during which the plants could access it. In sections 2 and 4, the rain was going through more quickly, following the paths of least resistance through soil with less root mass to interrupt its movement. She crouched in section 3 and pushed her fingers into the ground and felt the moisture still present, still available, hours after it had fallen. She stayed crouched there for a long time. The cattle in section 1 were audible but not visible from this position, their voices carrying over the ridge in the still morning air. The sky was the particular blue that follows extended cloud cover, intensely clear, as though cleaned by what had just passed through it. She did not think specifically about any single thing. She was in the presence of something that had been promised by years of reading and patient observation, and that had now arrived in the form of wet soil around her fingers, and the experience of that arrival did not require thought so much as it required attention. She stood. She walked the remaining sections. She went back to the house and wrote 12 pages of observations before Owen was fully awake. He came to the kitchen table and found her writing. He poured his coffee and sat across from her. He waited for her to finish the paragraph. She set the pencil down. The rested sections held the moisture. She turned the notebook so he could read the column of measurements. 3/4 of an inch of rain, and sections 1, 3, and 5 are reading like they got an inch and a half. He read the numbers. His coffee steamed untouched. What does 4 show? 1/3 of the retention. Maybe less. 4 has been our shortest rest period. It's also the section with the most compaction from the previous owner's grazing patterns. Can it recover? Already recovering. It'll take another full cycle before the retention rate approaches the others. She looked at what she had written, but it'll get there. He picked up his coffee. Marsh came by when you were out walking, left a survey map at the door. She looked at the window, early. The horn boy was with him. Owen looked at the steam from his cup. Thomas brought his own notebook. By December, the rhythm that had been Willa's alone for 22 months had begun to expand. Thomas Horn came to Saddleback Ranch 2 mornings a week, working through the principles of the rotation system against the specific conditions of the horny east pasture, which had its own drainage characteristics, its own soil variation, its own history of use requiring a design calibrated to those particulars rather than simply copied from Willa's layout. Marsh came twice with his benchland survey, leaving each time with questions he returned with answered, the conversations gradually accumulating into an understanding of what his 60 acres could support. Neither of them had been invited. Both had been made welcome, which was not the same thing, and both understood the distinction. Willa showed them the same thing, not a prescription, but a way of reading. The notebook, when she opened it, was not a recipe but a record years of observation organized into a language that described what land did when it was treated with precision, and the specific difference between those outcomes expressed in numbers drawn from this soil, these grasses, this water. We didn't invent any of this, she said one morning, both men present at the kitchen table, the survey maps of 3 different properties laid out with their edges overlapping. The survey office in Santa Fe has documents going back to the 1860s describing rotation grazing as a method. What we did here is practice it consistently enough and long enough to see what it actually produces. She looked at the maps. The hard part isn't knowing. The hard part is doing it for the second year when the first year looks like it might not be working. Thomas Horn wrote that down. Marsh looked at the map of his benchland and said nothing, which was a different kind of understanding. Owen rebuilt the Section 6 fence line through December, the arm at full strength, working in the cold mornings with a methodical efficiency that was his particular quality. He set 12 new posts and restrung 300 feet of wire and came in at noon each day, with hands too cold to hold the cup properly and no complaint about it. The fence at completion was better than it had ever been, not just repaired but improved. The posts deeper, the wire gauge heavier where the cattle pressure was highest. Willa walked the finished fence in the first week of January, the new year beginning in the cold clarity of a high desert winter morning, her breath visible, the ground under a thin cover of frost that the November rains had made possible. The fence was sound. The sections it divided were in varying states of recovery and use, the rotation cycling through the winter at the reduced pace that cold temperatures and slower grass metabolism required. The herd moved through the sections with the trained contentment of animals that had never known a different system that had been born into this management or adapted to it in their first weeks on the ranch, so that the movement between sections was simply the rhythm of their days. She stopped at the upper corner of Section 3 and looked out at the Saddleback Formation from this elevation, the full run of the 40 acres from the lower tank to the upper bench, the fence lines dividing it into the 7 sections that had carried them through a drought that had ended 14 operations and reduced most of the others to survival arithmetic. The creek below the property was running again. Not high, not the creek of older residents' memories, but moving a real current over the stones of its bed, finding the path it had always known. Returning to its function with the patience of water that has always understood it has time. Owen was visible below, moving along the lower fence line, checking the posts. He moved with the full economy of a man working without pain, his pace deliberate, his attention complete. She watched him for a moment before she opened the notebook. She pulled a sample cluster from the base of a tobosa clump and found the roots at a depth that the pre-drought surface would not have predicted. The system was working at the level below the visible, which was the only level that mattered when the visible was unreliable. She set the clump back, pressed the soil around its base, and wrote the January date at the top of the page. Root depth observation, Section 3, upper quadrant. The numbers she wrote were consistent with the previous month's reading, which was consistent with the reading before that. The recovery was continuing. It was not dramatic. It did not produce the kind of visible spectacle that would have made the 2 years of precise patient management legible to someone looking for a single moment of confirmation. It was the kind of truth that lived in accumulation in column after column of numbers, telling the same story in slightly improved terms each time they were recorded. She closed the notebook. walked down from the section corner toward the lower fence, where Owen had finished his morning check and was standing at the gate looking up at her coming down the slope. He had a cup in each hand, the steam from both of them visible in the cold air. He had come out with them deliberately, which was its own kind of sentence. She reached the gate. He held out one of the cups. She took it. Below them the creek moved over its stones, quiet and persistent, in no hurry, going exactly where it had always been going. Above them the 40 acres that no one had wanted, and everyone had doubted, went about the work of becoming what careful attention over time could make of a hard piece of ground, not a showpiece, not a monument to any single decision, but a working ranch, alive in the particular way of land that has been heard.